Man, I like that. Good singing. Good singing. Going to be in the book of Exodus. Book of Exodus. And I had debated about whether or not to start tonight. So we're going. We're moving forward here. Yeah, we'll be in Exodus 1. If anybody wants to go back in Genesis and look at the resources that I used, I can make that available to you. Two primary resources. Well, we went through a book called Exploring Genesis by John Phillips. That was a resource we pulled from. And there was another book that we pulled from. It was from the Advanced Bible Institute by David Cloud, and it was just Genesis, Teacher's Edition Genesis. And so those were two of the several resources that we used in studying that. Most of my material, my own personal notes, I've got them chapter by chapter on our Google Drive, but a lot of the notes are just handwritten, and I've got a couple spiral-bound notebooks of notes from that Genesis study. And so, does anybody like to type? I'm going to throw this out there. It would be great. I would compensate you for it. What do they call that when you take it from transcribing? I need a transcriber or a transcriptionist. Which one is it? I like transcriber. This is East Tennessee. That's right. Any preacher that calls it acapello and not acapella is right on par with transcriber. Not a transcriptionist. That's just too fancy of a word. Anyway, if you'd be interested in that, let me know. We'll compensate you for your labor. I'd like to get that in digital form. And it looks like Exodus is going the same way, so because all my stuff's written out so far. All right, Exodus chapter 1. Obviously, this chapter picks up where Genesis left off. One person said nothing started in Exodus and nothing's finished. It's just, they're coming out there. And we'll see that in just a minute. What we see is the first generation, the first chapter, we'll see that that first generation of Hebrews there, they die off. And that first generation of Egyptians that knew Joseph, they die off. And another king, another Pharaoh comes into power that sits on the throne that does not know Joseph. And so, because of his fear of the Hebrews, his fear provokes him to devise wicked plans, really to control these Hebrew people. His first plan, we'll see that, and his second plan, we'll see it in the first chapter. But his first plan was slavery. And his second plan was selective killing or selective genocide. He was killing him, and we know this story. First few chapters are going to be very familiar with us. So let's read here in verse number 1. Now these are the names of the children of Israel, which came into Egypt. Every man and his household came with Jacob. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin. Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls. For Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. Let me just pause right there. Anybody remember what one of the promises was that God gave to Abraham? What was that? Father. He would be. It shouldn't be as a sand of the sea. We're seeing that promise that God gave to Abraham being fulfilled here. They're multiplying exceedingly. You've probably heard similar numbers that I have heard. They estimate when the children of Israel came out of Egypt that 70 people had grown into, somebody give us the number that you've heard, what was it? 2 million people. I've heard some say it may even have been up to 5. 2 million people. That's a lot of folks from 70 people. And so God's promise to Abraham is being fulfilled here. We're seeing that come to pass. But as we read on through this chapter, we're going to see some interesting points. Pharaoh sets up his wicked plan to control these Hebrews, and what we're going to see is he puts on some unreasonable service to these folks. Look what it says here in verse number 8. Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, I find this interesting. He didn't know Joseph. But notice what he said in verse 9. Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. He called them the children of Israel. He didn't know Joseph. But he said the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. He's saying there, we're outnumbered and they're stronger than we are. More and mightier than we. Verse number 10, he says, come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us. And notice what he says here. And so get them up out of the land. His first plan here is his answer to him fearing that he might lose control of these people. To my understanding, from what we covered in Genesis, I don't think they became slaves and in bondage during that time of famine. I don't think that's when it was. But we'll see here, this is where he puts them into bondage here in Exodus 1 here. So his first plan, he lays down some unreasonable service and he gets an unpredicted result. Look what it says here. In verse number 11. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. And here's the unexpected result. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And this next phrase is interesting. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And so I'm looking at this thinking, all right, Pharaoh wants to control the people. He doesn't want them to leave the land. But he doesn't want them to outnumber them either. He wants to keep them subject to him. He wants to keep them weak and a manageable number. And he makes them his slaves. He sets taskmasters over them. He puts heavy burdens on them. He commissions, or he rather commands them to build these 2 cities for him. And the more they're doing this, the more they're multiplying. And then it says, and they were grieved because of the children of Israel. So I'm thinking, why were they grieved? What? I don't think the children, we don't read anything or get any indication that the children of Israel were causing the Egyptians trouble. I've never got that impression from it, have you? So I'm not sure why was he grieved because of them. He was. Maybe. It doesn't say just Pharaoh was grieved, it says they. So you've got the Egyptian people being grieved because of the Israelites. And I don't know, it may have something. You've got pagans here observing people that are serving the true and living God. And Miss Lane, you may be right. There could be some jealousy. But they may be seeing that God is blessing them and not them. And here the 70 have now become millions. And they're outnumbering them. And they're mightier than them. And they're outpowering them. And so they make them slaves. And they put heavy burdens on them, and that doesn't stop one bit. The harder they, the more under their thumb they try to put them, the stronger they get. The more they try to control them, the more they multiply, and the more they grow. And so it's grieving them. It's grieving them. Pharaoh's plans are not working out like he thought they would. His purpose in enslaving them and putting burdens on them, his purpose was to eventually, they're not going to have as many children now. They're going to, we're just going to work them to death. Work them so much, then they're not going to grow and they're not going to multiply. But it didn't work. It didn't work at all. He had an unreasonable service and he had an unpredicted result of it. Look what it says. Well, he wanted to keep their population under control. We see that in verse 9. He said they're getting more and mightier than we. He wanted to use them for his purpose. Verse number 11, he used them to build his cities, his treasure cities. Pharaoh wanted to use these people for his own purpose and his own glory rather than for God's purpose and God's glory. He didn't want to lose them as his own possession. That's how this Pharaoh, saw these people. He saw them as property. He saw them as his property. And when you think about that ideology and that mindset, most dictators throughout history and most dictators that are in power even today, they hold that very same ideology. That people are property to be bought, owned, traded, sold, controlled, whatever, killed, whatever. That's how they view people, as property. Same ideology behind that's the same ideology behind all these corrupt forms of government. Socialism, people are property. Communism, people are property. Marxism, all these things, people become property. Listen, our government is moving more in that direction. I don't want to sound like a doom and gloom here. But they want you and they want your kids and they want to control you and they want to control your kids. That's the goal of some of them. It really is. But that kind of ideology, that kind of thinking where people are property, I'm just going to throw this out in the form of a question. What does that always lead to? When the authority views people as property, what does that always lead to? Slavery? Yeah. Leads to something much worse than that. It is a devaluing. Bondage. All right. All right. We know where this story goes. Think about some famous dictators throughout history that had the same ideology. Adolf Hitler. What did that ideology lead to? Genocide. Marx. What did that lead to? Genocide. Or Stalin. What did it lead to? Genocide. All these people all these dictators that viewed their people, their subjects, as their property for their purpose, it always led to mass genocide, killing of millions of people. Absolutely. Even in the New Testament, you can see people when they got scared, and the people in authority, they'd put the children to death. Genocide. They just felt like they were the authority, the people were property that could be disposed of at their whims. It's wicked. And that's where this is going to. All right, let's pick up in verse number 13. Verse 12 says the Egyptians, they were grieved at the children of Israel, rather than the children of Israel were grieved at the Egyptians. All right, verse 13. So, Pharaoh's plan is not working to control these people. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. Rigor, that's an interesting word. You've heard of it. Somebody might have a rigorous exercise or a rigorous word. Rigorous, that means very strict. Rigorous means very harsh. And so these Egyptians are serving, they have a very strict schedule, a very harsh schedule. That's the burden that's on them. And just put yourself in their position. You have taskmasters over you, making you work to their standard, serving them with rigor. And verse 14 says, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick and in all manner of service in the field, and all their service wherein they made them serve, here it says it again, was with rigor. Very strict, very harsh. Now there's a picture here. The children of Israel were in this condition. They were in bondage now. And they could not get out of this bondage. Their taskmasters controlled them. Pharaoh controlled them. Their daily lives were bitter. Their life was not full of joy and comfort and pleasantness, but it was bitter. And it wasn't, all right, what do you want to do today? Well, let's go to the park. Let's go shopping. Well, let's do this or let's do that. You didn't have a freedom to choose what you wanted to do for the day. That was gone. It's hard for us to put ourselves in a position like that. But you woke up at a certain time. You had to be somewhere. And if you weren't there at a certain time, there's no telling what would happen to you or even your family. So they made you serve. Your life was bitter. They controlled your life. Nobody likes to live their life being controlled by somebody else. But there's a parallel picture here. The children of Israel, when they're in bondage to the Egyptians, when they're in Egyptian bondage, that state of the Israelites pictures the state of a lost person before they come to Christ. A lost person is in bondage. They're under the control of a very harsh taskmaster. Their life is bitter. They serve sin and Satan with rigor. Strict, he's harsh. The devil is not fun. He's one preacher, there was a book, All Satan's Apples Have Worms. You know, he paints a pretty picture, but it's rotten. The life of a lost person is rotten. It's no good. It's not joy and play. It's bitter. You'll serve your life with rigor and hard bondage. And that's the picture we have here. And you know, sin, here's the thing about sin, and we all know this to be true, is there's a time of pleasure when it comes to sin. But sin is only pleasurable for a season. And once you play, then you pay. And here, these children of Israel, they're in hard bondage here. Unreasonable service, unpredicted results. He didn't think they'd grow like they did. So let's look in verse number 15. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Shipra, and the name of the other Pua. And he said, this is a horrible request, and he said, when ye do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. I'm reminded of a proverb that says, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked beareth rule, the people mourn. And this Pharaoh was a wicked ruler. And so his first plan didn't work. Putting these people in bondage, putting them in slavery, we'll be able to control them then, manage them better. But it didn't work. So now his answer is, all right, we're going to have selective genocide. And he calls together these midwives, and from what I understand is these midwives probably had several midwives under them. That's possible. These were the heads, like a trade. Here's the midwives, because there's 2 million people here, right? It doesn't make sense that there's only 2 midwives. So these would be the heads, and they'd be several midwives under them likely. And so he calls Shipra and Pua in, and he said, hey, look, ladies, when you're getting ready to do the work of a midwife and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, Pharaoh said, I want you to kill them, but if it's a daughter, let him live. Now, you know the purpose of this, but maybe for the younger people, think about this. Why was Pharaoh doing that? Why did he say just kill the boys? That's right. That's good. That would control the population. They wouldn't have soldiers in the future, as many soldiers. That's good. But that's what his purpose was. He didn't want the fighters. That's very good. He didn't want them growing any more in population. That's what he wanted there. So kill all the boys. Kill all the boys. And so notice what it says in verse number 17. Here's an unsuspected fear. Pharaoh thought that these midwives feared him, but these midwives didn't fear Pharaoh. Verse 17 says, but the midwives feared God, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. All right, I'm just going to throw a simple question out to you. Why didn't these midwives do what Pharaoh told them to do? That's good. They feared God. But what was he? He was asking them to do what? He was asking them to murder, kill. Now this is not far from, it's not far from partial birth abortion. It's not far from the next step in legislation that says after the child's born, kill it. Not far from that, just a step, right? And so Pharaoh said, I want you Hebrew midwives to do this. But they didn't fear him, they feared God. And you know, there was a chance that they took, if you will, to disobey Pharaoh and obey God. What might have happened when word got back around to Pharaoh that they're not doing what he said? They could be dead. They could very likely be dead. Nobody'd say anything else about it. Kill them. Dead. But they feared God. And verse 17 says, it did not, as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men, children alive. Folks, I just want to throw this out there to you tonight. It's better to fear God than man. Anytime man's laws or somebody wants you to do something that contradicts or violates God's law, you always obey God's law. Always. You and I not only have the liberty, but are commanded to obey God rather than men. We know that in the New Testament also. When Peter and them were thrown into prison, and remember, God came and got Peter out of prison, and here they are preaching about the Lord Jesus, and the scribes and Pharisees come to him and say, hey, didn't we tell you to stop preaching in His name and stop teaching in His name? And the whole place is full of this doctrine, and we told you not to say that. And they said, we ought to obey God rather than men. So we see this principle all through the Bible, from the beginning to the end, where God commends people for obeying Him rather than men. And that's what these midwives did. They obeyed God rather than men. And verse 18 says, the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said unto them, why have ye done this thing and have saved the men, children of life? And it's really interesting what they say here. And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, because let me just read it. The Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. They just say, hey, Pharaoh, you don't know about these Hebrew women. They're tough. When that baby starts coming, it's there before we get to them. Boom. They're not like you Egyptians. Whining and crying. Take all day. Hebrews, they know how to do it. Boom. And obviously they were telling a story. That's a nice way of me saying they were lying. But notice what verse 20 says. Here's an unexpected reward. And there's a pronoun in here. I want you to notice it. Let me pick up verse 20. Therefore, and the therefore is because they feared God. Because they feared God. Therefore, God dealt well with the midwives. So He showed them favor. He dealt well with them. And the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. So Pharaoh's first plan to enslave them didn't work. And his second plan to kill them, that didn't work either. They're just growing and multiplying and growing and multiplying, just as God promised Abraham. And look what verse 21 says. Here's where I want you to notice that pronoun. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that He made them houses. Now there's an unexpected reward for their service. Who's the he in verse 21? God made them houses. Now, I don't think that God built them a physical, went down there, hammer and nail and saw and all that stuff, built them out. I don't think that's what it's saying there. I'll give you what I think, and take it or don't take it. But it was common that a midwife was a woman that did not, or most likely could not have children in this time. That was common. That a midwife was one who could not have children. And here, God, if that be the case, with Shiphrah and Puah, if that be the case, what it looks like to me that it's saying is because they feared God, God gave them what they didn't have. He gave them a family, a house. That's an unexpected reward. Don't tell me it doesn't pay to serve God. So many times when we are faced, should I obey God and do this, or should I, or am I going to do what they say to do? We think of all the consequences, what's going to happen, what's all bad going to happen to me, what's bad going to happen to me, what's bad going to happen to me. But we don't ever think how God might reward us. I know that's not the motivating factor, but there is a reward for our service. There is a reward for our service. And these two women, I'm telling you, I'm telling you, put them in the Hall of Faith right there. Shiphrah and Puah. They feared God. Moses, remember when God told him to go to Pharaoh? Remember what Moses said? I can't go. Send Aaron. At least let him talk to him for me. He was afraid. Shiphrah and Puah. You're not killing them boys. I don't care what he says. Those God's kids, those Hebrew kids. We're not killing them. We're going to birth them and take care of them. And if he wants to kill us, he's going to have to get past God to get to us. And so they feared God. And because of that, God made them houses. And my best understanding is he that's just it. There's a family that he made for them. They had a home now. At home. So there's an unexpected reward. And then verse 22, and we'll be through with this one. It says, now that was his second plan. Actually, he had three plans in this chapter. His first plan was slavery. That didn't work. His second plan was genocide by the Hebrew midwives. That did not work. The result of both of those actions was the children of Israel growing and growing and growing. He couldn't get the Hebrew midwives to kill the Hebrew boys. And that's where we pick up in verse 22. It says, and Pharaoh charged all, see the next two words? His people, saying, every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive. Pharaoh couldn't get God's people to kill these babies. He had to get his own people to do it. Boy, you can make a parallel with the day that we live in today, can't you? God's people, I'm just going to say it, God's people are not the ones running abortion clinics. It's the devil's people. I'm not ashamed to say that. God's people are not the ones doing it. They're not going to do it. Pharaoh couldn't get God's people to kill them. He had to get his own people to do gist of the message. I know it's not the most pleasant outline. Fear God, not man. There's a reward for obeying the Lord. There's a reward. Let's stand and we'll dismiss in prayer. We do have a business meeting. Heavenly Father, we pray that you'll help us to remember that. Lord, as we go day by day in our life, that there is a reward for serving you. There's a reward for obeying you. There's a reward for standing up for you. Not fearing man, but fearing and reverencing and respecting you. Lord, help us not, when we're faced with that chance, with that choice, Lord, help us not to look at what might happen to us. But Lord, help us to trust you. In Jesus Christ's name.